Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the IIT Gandhinagar uh, Connections program. My name is Nishaant Choksi. I'm a assistant professor here in the Humanities and Social Science discipline at IIT Gandhinagar. I'm the coordinator of our research group, the Indigenous Studies Work Group, about which I would like to discuss with you today. So first, what do we mean when we say indigenous studies? The name indigenous usually means original inhabitants, right? Uh, but it's also used for different kinds of communities. In South Asia, these communities have been called tribal, forest dwelling, hill dwelling, also Adivasi, scheduled tribe. There's been various names for these communities. Now, the study of these communities have primarily been looked at through the lens of certain academic disciplines, right? Most notably, anthropology and archaeology. Anthropologists set out to study the indigenous, usually through the lens of this idea of primitive. Primitive means the pre-civilized people, from whom we can learn the human history from. Other disciplines like development studies look at the indigenous or tribal communities through this idea of mainstream. How do we mainstream these communities? Right. And then the area studies sees the indigenous as the colonized subjects of either the Western empires or also the new nation states. So each of these disciplines have looked at the indigenous through these certain paradigms. But indigenous studies tries to look at the indigenous, work with the indigenous communities from their point of view, which is different than how the traditional disciplines have looked at them. So by indigenous studies and in creating an indigenous studies work group and research team through which we invite different people to collaborate with us, we're trying to create a new disciplinary framework that seeks to move beyond the traditional disciplinary framework and give an interdisciplinary approach where, as critical indigenous studies scholar Hokowitu writes, quote, scholars operationalize indigenous knowledge to help develop theories, build academic infrastructure, and inform and create new kinds of cultural and ethical practices within academia, within policy, within non-governmental organizations. So this is the goal of our Indigenous Studies work group. The word indigenous has come to us primarily from experiences within the societies that have been under settler colonialism. This means places like the Americas and Australia. But recently, the term indigenous has also been applied to various kinds of communities living in post-colonial countries and regions, like South Asia. In India, the word indigeneity is often a contested term. There are various groups vying for to be called indigenous. Oftentimes, we associate the word indigenous with the communities that are labeled as scheduled tribe under the Constitution, or communities that live in hill or forest areas. Many of these communities refer to themselves as Adivasis, or original inhabitants. The study of these communities have been uh, put under the framework of different names. For instance, Rycroft and Dasgupta propose an idea of Adivasi studies. And scholar activist Ganesh Devi has proposed the name tribal studies. These terms like Adivasi and tribal have been used quite extensively in certain regions of the country, like central India, east and west. But in other places, like the northeast, this term indigenous, Adivasi, tribal have different meanings. So there's not one unified term necessarily. Although all these terms are important. This is why we're framing it under a larger umbrella that we're calling Indigenous Studies. What is the goal of our work group? The goal is to provide a multidisciplinary framework to investigate the limits and possibilities of this idea of the indigenous from a both post-colonial perspective and a perspective rooted in South Asia and the diverse communities and society that we live in. Taking into account the interests of our member faculty, postdoctoral fellows, and students, we've developed several thematic areas in which we've already started producing a substantial body of research. These areas include the idea of indigeneity and language, of the area that I work in, along with postdoctoral fellows like Dr. Shakuntala Longkumer and PhD students Veshak and Deepika Meena. The other area is the question of indigeneity as it relates to the environment, which is led by Professor Ambika Ayadurai and includes research scholars and doctoral students like Bhavna Harchandani, Haukip Tangmiliang, Ayushi Rai. Then the question of indigeneity as it manifests in both in literature and literary theory, which is led by Professor Orko Chattopadhyay and research scholars such as Prashant, Parul Tiwari, Swati Joshi. And finally, indigeneity and heritage, which is led by Professor Alok Kanungo and includes postdoctoral fellows Dr. Tosabanta Pradhan and Dr. Alino Sumi. With this work group, we hope to reach out to other centers and academic research institutes in different regions of the country working on similar topics, to partner with governmental and non-governmental organizations working on issues related to the theme areas, to attract students from Indigenous backgrounds or from Indigenous regions, or students interested in these topics related to Indigenous communities for postgraduate research at master's, doctoral, and postdoctoral levels. And also to partner with Indigenous communities to further different community-led initiatives and provide space, support, and capacity building. These are some of the references, and thank you for joining us.